Nobody thought Johnny Cash would walk out of Folsom Prison, the same man who walked in. January 13th, 1968, a Sunday morning. The most dangerous men in California were waiting in a cafeteria that smelled like industrial cleaner and decades of desperation. Outside, armed guards stood on watchtowers. Inside, 2,000 convicted felons sat on metal benches, waiting for a country singer most of them had never heard of, to prove he wasn't just another celebrity using them for a photo opportunity. Johnny Cash hadn't had a top 10 hit in 3 years. His last album sold poorly. Columbia Records was losing patience. His manager was fielding questions about whether it was time to transition into other opportunities. Industry code for retirement. Cash was 35 years old, addicted to amphetamines, and watching his career collapse in slow motion. Then he pitched the concert that everyone told him would end everything. But to understand why Johnny Cash insisted on recording a live album inside one of America's most violent maximum security prisons, you have to go back 7 years earlier, to a promise he made in a place most people were trying to forget. 1961. Johnny Cash was at the peak of his fame. "I Walk the Line" had made him a household name. He was selling out auditoriums across the country. And then his manager booked him for something unusual, a concert at Folsom State Prison in Texas. Cash walked into that prison expecting to perform for criminals. What he found were men who knew every word to every song he'd ever written. Inmates who'd been listening to his music on contraband radios. Men who heard something in his voice that the pop charts couldn't measure. A darkness, a recklessness, an understanding of what it meant to be on the wrong side of the law and the wrong side of luck. After the show, an inmate approached him. "The man's name is lost to history, but his words aren't. You sang like you've been here before." Cash hadn't. Not as an inmate, but he understood the feeling. He'd been arrested multiple times, mostly drug possession, once for smuggling amphetamines across the Mexican border in his guitar case. He'd spent nights in small-town jails, waking up in cells that smelled like vomit and regret. He knew what it felt like to be locked away from the world, even if only for a few hours. But more than that, Johnny Cash had always identified with outsiders. The broke, the forgotten, the people polite society crossed the street to avoid. And so he made a promise. He'd come back, not just to Huntsville, to other prisons. He'd keep singing for the men nobody wanted to hear from. By 1968, he'd performed at nearly a dozen prisons across America. But he'd never recorded an album in one. Late 1967, Cash walked into Columbia Records' office in Nashville with a proposal that made every executive in the room uncomfortable. He wanted to record his next album live at Folsom State Prison in California. Not a studio album with prison themes. Not a few songs recorded at a prison and mixed with studio tracks. A full live album. Raw, unedited, real. The label's response was immediate. No. Too risky, too uncommercial. Prison albums didn't sell. Country radio wouldn't touch it. And besides, Cash's last few albums had underperformed. This was the time to play it safe, not gamble on a concept album recorded in front of convicted murderers and rapists. But Cash wouldn't let it go. He'd been thinking about Folsom for years. The prison had a mythology in American culture. It was one of the oldest and most notorious penitentiaries in the country. It had been immortalized in songs and films, and Cash himself had written Folsom Prison Blues back in 1955, a song that became one of his signature hits. The line, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," had made people uncomfortable from the moment he wrote it. Now he wanted to sing it to men who actually had. His producer, Bob Johnston, saw something the executives didn't. Johnston understood that Johnny Cash's career wasn't going to be saved by playing it safe. The pop country crossover hits weren't coming back. The industry was changing, and Cash needed to do something bold, something that reminded people why they fell in love with his music in the first place. Johnston convinced Columbia to let them do it. One album, one shot. If it flopped, Cash's contract probably wouldn't be renewed. Folsom State Prison wasn't just any jail. Built in 1880, it was California's second oldest prison and one of its most violent. Inmates called it the end of the world. Guards called it a powder keg. The prison had seen riots, murders, and escape attempts that ended in bloodshed. Cash didn't care. He spent weeks preparing the set list. He didn't want to sanitize anything. He wanted to perform songs that spoke to the reality these men lived. Songs about crime, consequences, loneliness, and the impossibility of redemption. Folsom Prison Blues, obviously. Cocaine Blues, a murder ballad about a man who kills his woman and gets sentenced to 99 years. Dark as a dungeon, a miner's lament that doubled as a meditation on being trapped underground, physically and spiritually. I Got Stripes, a chain gang song. And new material, songs he'd been writing in the months leading up to the concert. Songs nobody had heard yet. But there was a problem. June Carter. June Carter wasn't just Johnny Cash's duet partner. She was the person who'd been trying to save his life for years. They'd been performing together since the early 1960s. She'd watched him spiral into amphetamine addiction. She'd seen him show up to concerts so high he could barely stand. She'd covered for him when he forgot lyrics, missed cues, or collapsed backstage. And she'd refused to marry him. Not because she didn't love him, but because she knew that if she married him while he was still using, she'd be enabling the very thing that was killing him. When Cash told her about the Folsom concert, she didn't try to stop him, but she made it clear, if this was going to be his comeback, he had to show up clean. Not sober for a week, not better than usual, actually clean. Cash promised. It was a promise he'd broken before. The morning of the concert, Johnny Cash woke up in a hotel room in Sacramento. He hadn't slept. His hands were shaking, not from withdrawal, from nerves. He'd performed for presidents. He'd played the Grand Ole Opry. He'd toured the world. But this felt different. Because if the inmates didn't believe him, the whole thing would collapse. Prisoners had a radar for fakeness. They could smell a celebrity slumming it from a mile away. If Cash walked in there trying to be their friend, trying to play the sympathetic outsider, they'd see through it instantly. He had to be himself. The broken, reckless, too honest version of himself that polite society didn't want to see. At 9:30 a.m., Cash and his band, the Tennessee Three, plus June Carter and the Carter family, loaded their equipment into a van and drove to Folsom. The prison sat on a hillside overlooking the American River. The walls were gray concrete, topped with barbed wire. Guard towers loomed at every corner. Cash walked through the gates. The first thing that hit him was the sound. Metal doors slamming, echoes bouncing off concrete, the hum of overhead lights. And beneath it all, the low murmur of 2,000 men who'd been locked in cells for years, some for decades. The warden met him in the yard. "We've got 2 shows scheduled," the warden said. 9:40 a.m. and 12:40 p.m. Same set list. "We're recording both." Cash nodded. The warden hesitated. Then, "These men aren't your fans, Mr. Cash. Don't expect a warm welcome." Cash smiled. Good. The cafeteria had been converted into a makeshift concert hall. Metal benches arranged in rows, a small stage at one end, microphones, amps, and recording equipment scattered around, and guards everywhere, armed, stone-faced, ready to shut the whole thing down at the first sign of trouble. The inmates filed in. Murderers, rapists, armed robbers, gang members, men serving life sentences, men who would never see the outside world again. They sat in silence. Cash walked on stage. No introduction, no warm-up act. He just picked up his guitar, stepped up to the microphone, and said, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash." The room erupted. Not polite applause, not the kind of reception you get at a county fair or a concert hall. This was primal. Screaming, whistling, the sound of men who'd been starved of anything real for so long that even the presence of another human being who wasn't a guard or a chaplain felt like oxygen. Cash waited for the noise to die down. Then he launched into Folsom Prison Blues. The guitar riff cut through the room like a blade. And when Cash reached the line, "But I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," the inmates exploded. They cheered, not because they thought murder was funny, but because finally someone was saying out loud what everyone else whispered about. The violence, the darkness, the things polite people pretended didn't exist. Cash didn't flinch. He leaned into it. Between songs, he joked with the crowd. When a train passed by outside, its whistle audible even through the prison walls, Cash stopped mid-song, grinned, and said, "That's the train that goes to San Antonio. I know you boys wish you were on it." The inmates roared, because it was true, and Cash didn't pretend otherwise. Halfway through the set, Cash introduced a song nobody had heard before, Greystone Chapel. It had been written by an inmate at Folsom named Glenn Shirley. Shirley was serving time for armed robbery. He'd written the song about the prison chapel, a place where men went not for redemption, but for a few minutes of silence away from the violence of the yard. Cash had received a tape of the song just weeks before the concert. He learned it, rehearsed it, and now he was performing it, for the first time, live, in front of the man who wrote it. Glenn Shirley was in the audience. He didn't know Cash was going to sing his song. When Cash started playing, Shirley froze. The other inmates noticed. Word spread through the rows. "That's Glenn's song. Cash is singing Glenn's song." And for 3 minutes, the entire room went silent. Not the tense, waiting for violence silence of a prison yard, but the kind of silence that happens when people witness something sacred. When the song ended, the applause wasn't loud. It was reverent, because every man in that room understood what had just happened. Johnny Cash hadn't just performed for them. He'd validated them. He'd taken something one of them created, something born in a cell, in isolation, in despair, and treated it like it mattered. Glenn Shirley would later say it was the first time in years he felt like a human being. At 12:40 p.m., Cash did it all again. Same setlist, same energy, but something was different. He was looser, more confident. The inmates were louder, more responsive. The guards had relaxed slightly, realizing that this wasn't going to turn into a riot. And Cash fed off it. He told stories between songs, about getting arrested, about his own mistakes, about the time he accidentally started a forest fire in California and nearly got sent to prison himself. The inmates loved it, because Cash wasn't performing at them, he was performing with them. By the end of the second show, the cafeteria felt less like a prison and more like a revival tent. Men were on their feet, voices hoarse from shouting. Some were crying. When Cash walked off stage, the warden approached him. "I've been working here for 17 years, the warden said. "I've never seen anything like that." Cash didn't respond. He was already thinking about what came next. Columbia Records released at Folsom Prison in May 1968. The label had low expectations. They pressed a modest number of copies, figuring it would appeal to Cash's core fan base and not much else. They were wrong. The album went to #1 on the country charts. It crossed over to the pop charts, eventually hitting number 13 on the Billboard 200. It sold over 3 million copies in the first year. Folsom Prison Blues, a song Cash had written 13 years earlier, was re-released as a single and became his first top 40 pop hit in years. Critics called it a masterpiece. Not just a great live album, but one of the most important recordings in American music history. But the real impact wasn't measured in sales. Johnny Cash had gambled everything on a concert most people told him was career suicide. And he won, but not because the album was commercially successful. He won because he'd redefined what his career could be. Before Folsom, Cash was trying to fit into the Nashville establishment, trying to write hits, trying to be palatable. After Folsom, he stopped trying. He embraced his identity as an outlaw, a voice for the voiceless, a man who sang for prisoners, addicts, and everyone polite society had written off. The album opened doors. He was invited to perform at more prisons. He recorded a follow-up live album at San Quentin in 1969 that became even bigger. He got his own TV variety show, where he invited controversial guests and refused to sanitize his image. And slowly, he got clean. Not because of the album, but because the album reminded him who he was and who he wanted to be. June Carter married him later that year. There's a footnote to this story that most people don't know. Glenn Shirley, the inmate who wrote Greystone Chapel, was paroled in 1971. Johnny Cash hired him, brought him on tour, gave him a chance to start over. It didn't last. Shirley struggled on the outside. The fame was too much. The world had changed too much. He couldn't adjust. In 1978, Glenn Shirley took his own life. Cash never talked about it publicly, but those who knew him said he carried the guilt for years, that he wondered if he'd done enough, if he'd pushed too hard, if the song that gave Shirley hope had also set him up for a fall he couldn't survive. There are no easy redemption stories, not in Folsom, not in Nashville, not anywhere. 56 years later, at Folsom Prison is still considered one of the greatest live albums ever recorded. Not because of the production quality. The recording is raw, sometimes messy. You can hear the prison sounds in the background, the clanging of doors, the shuffling of feet. But that's exactly why it matters. Because Johnny Cash didn't sanitize anything. He didn't try to make prison sound romantic or noble. He didn't pretend that the men in that room were misunderstood heroes. He just showed up, sang honestly, and treated them like human beings. In an industry built on image and artifice, Cash did something radical. He told the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was what people had been waiting to hear. The Folsom Prison concert wasn't a gamble because it might have failed commercially. It was a gamble because Johnny Cash had to bet on himself. He had to believe that the darkest, most honest version of who he was, the addict, the outlaw, the man who identified more with criminals than with country club executives, was worth something, that people would respond to it, that it mattered. He was right, but the cost was higher than anyone expected. Because once you stop pretending, you can't go back. Johnny Cash spent the rest of his life trying to live up to the man he'd been on that stage at Folsom, the man who sang for prisoners, the man who refused to look away from the ugly parts of America. Some days he succeeded, some days he didn't, but he never stopped trying. And that, more than any album or award or hit single, is why people still remember his name.